Hello, I'm Hayden, and I work with Nolan and Brennan when we use the real estate data set in order to predict price. We took this as from the perspective of people who are working with a real estate company that wants to be able to predict what their clients' prices would be and give them an estimate. In order to do so, we had to narrow down our field of data. Since there were a few houses that had a way too high price for apparently no reason we could discern, we decided to remove those, as well as some that had a very large square footage, which did not fit well with the data set. Next, we moved on to eliminating the state section, since all of them occurred in the same state, which is the same reason why we eliminated the country aspect. As for year renovated, it was not very helpful and not very good at predicting price, so we found it unimportant. Square footage basement, however, would have been useful, but since we already had square footage living and square footage above, we felt that it was very derivative and didn't want to let square footage have too big of an impact on price when using it as a predictor. Finally, we made an additional data set which focused on the cities, since we wanted to determine if cities did affect price, as that could be looked at for further investigation. Looking at the correlations, square footage living obviously has the highest correlation at 0.61, followed shortly by square footage above at 0.52. So this is part of why we removed square footage of the basement, as we didn't want it to have too big of an impact, since they already have two different square footage measuring in both lot and above. Surprisingly, bathrooms is actually high at 0.46, which we did not expect, but actually became a very important factor in our regressions. Looking at the graphs of these, we can obviously see that yes, bathrooms did have a relatively strong correlation with price, whereas square footage, obviously with the highest, is very clearly there. However, being all of them clustered in the bottom left, we would wish to look at them separately later on to determine if there was any other factors affecting this. Looking at the bedrooms, obviously there is correlation, though it's much weaker than the other two. However, cities, we were able to determine that yes, there is a effect on price based on your city. However, when trying to use that in the data set, we found it unhelpful, as determining all the cities in the country would be difficult and unhelpful, so we decided to include it for further investigation and move forward. Year built was actually appeared to have no correlation with price when used in a simple linear regression. However, as you'll see in the next slide, when used with other variables, it actually has a very large impact, being the fourth highest in terms of correlation with price when taking account into the other variables. Obviously, square footage living is clearly the best, with bathrooms at third. Square footage above being a derivative of square footage living, we decided to include it in a few of our tested models, but ultimately excluded it. Since there was a clear division between the better variables and the worse ones, we decided to test all of the variables in our first model and then narrowing it down to the better ones, mostly focusing on year built, bathrooms, square footage of the lot, and square footage living. We used two types of models, both the interactive and the additive, to see which one would be best in determining how price is affected. Of the models that we tested, these four were the key models that we saw. Obviously, the one where we tested every variable possible has the highest R squared and the lowest ACI. Second, where we used four variables, continues to have a very high R squared and low ACI. So clearly the rest of these variables did not contribute very much, so we decided to discount them moving forward. The other model, which is the same as Model 7, however Model 7 being interactive, was much better than Model 3. So clearly interactive models we determined were better than additive models. And being Model 7 had the best among the interactive models, except for one that included square footage of the lot, which we did not find to be a too important variable, as it only affected R squared by a small amount and ultimately is harder to predict when determining what kind of house an individual would want. So we decided to ultimately choose Model 7 as the model we would present to the real estate company as the one to predict price for their customers. Since all three of the variables are very simple, and the customers would have a general idea of how big of a house they would want, how many bathrooms they would want, and whether they were on one of the newer models versus an older style of housing. And having an R-squared of 0.45 is very good, especially its AIC, ACI, which is much lower than the others involved, except for the largest model. The other investigations that we could have done, but ultimately decided not to as we were focusing on the data set as a whole, included location-based. Since we did have the zip code and cities, we could have tested it more, but discounted it as we're looking for a general model that could be used anywhere by this real estate company to determine prices. Square footage types, as we said, there were 4 different types, and ultimately we decided to exclude only square footage above and square footage below, since they were very derivative of square footage living. We could test how 4 models interact and see which variables are most important and how they affect the other ones to see which ones to ultimately choose in a model, which we could investigate further, but simply decided to leave it at square footage living for now. Housing interior was also something that we somewhat included in our model using bathrooms. However, we discounted bedrooms since bathrooms had a much higher correlation with price. Ultimately though, housing interior, square footage living, basements existing or not, bedrooms, bathrooms, there are many things that you could examine to determine how that affects price and whether the interior of the house is more important than the exterior when determining price, or the alternative is true. Thus, we determined that Model 7 was the best, but there was much left to investigate that could be useful. Thank you.